First met Brother Michael, he had taught at LaSalle Academy for several years and had carried out several other ministries. He was a semi-retired Christian brother of the Catholic Church and a well-regarded artist exhibiting at local galleries. At an exhibit of his then recent work, I was drawn to his simple watercolor paintings of daily life in a small village in Africa. I was also taken with Brother Michael's self-effacing presence and his humble response to praise of his work. Not personally knowing other people living in religious communities, I was intrigued by the fact that Brother Michael was living in the Christian Brothers Center, a community of Catholic brothers, and so freely interacting with the secular world. My limited experience of the nuns that I knew as a child did not include such fraternization, but that was decades ago. When I found out that he was also teaching art classes, I decided to take one. Brother Michael was the kindest of teachers. He encouraged everyone, but didn't hesitate to offer honest feedback. He had a quirky sense of humor and could be a bit of a prankster. He had a lot of artistic knowledge and many life experiences to share. I had a lot to learn from him. So I took more classes. We really enjoyed each other's company, and we began occasionally painting outside of class together. We often painted on plein air or on location and just talked about life, sharing our very different experiences. We sometimes got together for coffee to share what we had been working on and to continue the conversation. For both of us, it was a chance not only to paint, but to learn about a life very different from our own. I had always had an interest in monastic life, though never with any desire or intent to participate in it. The order and structure of such a community was tempting. My interest, though, was not based on any religious fervor, but rather had to do with the appeal of giving up control, a perceived freedom from decisions, a desire to be taken care of, and the potential to be freed from the chaos of life. At the same time, I was and still am fiercely independent, two very different sides of my character. We found that we had some things in common. We both had several siblings. We had an early love for ice skating. We always loved to draw. We both often felt awkward in social settings. We preferred to be by the ocean or in the woods. A notable similarity was that we had both lost a sibling at a very formative time in our youth, and in both cases, that loss led to changes in the trajectory of our lives. But there were a lot of differences. Brother Michael grew up in a family that was devoted to the Catholic Church. His sister also serves the church as a Franciscan nun. Though my mother's family was very church-oriented, my mother did not carry that practice forth, and I only grew up with a very brief introduction to the Catholic Church. Because of my mother's excommunication after her second marriage, I saw the church as punishing and demanding. Brother Michael lived a life that included daily scheduled communal prayer. I wasn't attending any church at the time, and I didn't have a prayer practice. Though he had some input, many of his decisions were made for him. Where he was going to live, what he would eat, where he would work. He could use a car if one was available, but he didn't have to make sure the oil got changed or save to buy a new one. As a single mother of two, I had spent years struggling with myriad decisions, from how to stretch a dollar to how to teach my children to be kind and responsible humans. On the other hand, because I could make choices and decisions, I potentially had the ability to drastically change my life. Drastically changing his life might have meant that Brother Michael would have had to leave the very thing to which he had devoted his life, living out his faith in religious community. Despite the different life situations, I learned that there were similarities. Communal life can be much like family life. There are jealousies and annoyances. You may be close to one person and dislike another. Living in a religious community does not protect one from feeling anger, confusion, and disappointment. Our conversations touched on so many things. He had received a lot of art training and had many related experiences that I would have loved to have had. I had many experiences that were not possible in the life that he had chosen. Different living situations, different types of relationships, a wide variety of jobs, and children. I painted more and better because of the time we spent together. I appreciated that he wanted to show me his new work and that he wanted to see mine. Though we only painted together occasionally over perhaps 2 years' time, we remained good friends, and I was able to visit him several times when he moved to New Jersey, near where my daughter lives. I was really happy to be able to bring my grandson there to visit him. Though aphasia had robbed him of the ability to speak by that time, his joy during the visit was obvious. I considered our friendship a gift, and I believe he did also. And it is a gift I will be forever grateful for.
Was the greatest president ever to serve our Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Aside from being the first person of color to serve in that role, he was also the first person to legally officiate a same-sex wedding in the United States at the Massachusetts State House, right next door to our headquarters. Even if you didn't know him, if you've been around a while, you probably know his most popular initiative, encouraging all Unitarian Universalists to come up with their own elevator speech, a short, concise, and memorable statement that sums up your personal understanding of our shared faith. Reverend Sinkford, in my estimation, is a real prophet. By that, I don't mean that he had some kind of God-given vision into the future. When I call him a prophet, I mean that he has the ability to witness events of our times, analyze how they relate to each other, and what their likely outcomes will be, and to predict what will happen in the near or often distant future. Here's an example. Early in his term as president, I heard him speak not once but twice about stridency. And he noticed a fairly new but fast accelerating trend. Nationally, public discourse was getting more urgent and more acrimonious. The rancorous election of 2000 was barely in our rearview mirror, with its anxious 24-hour news cycle, its frenetic recounts, and the endless debates over hanging chads. Remember hanging chads and all the anxiety those created? Even then, there were claims of stolen elections. Politicians were becoming more unwilling to work across the aisle in the name of philosophical purity. And many ordinary citizens were taking things very personally. Too many of us felt like the vote for the other party wasn't just a difference in approach or opinion, it was a vote against my right to earn a living, or a vote against my right to exist with a minority identity. He argued then, 23 years ago, and I would agree then and now, that when we hold too tightly to our opinions, when we're too strident in what we believe, we dehumanize each other. We make neighbors into opponents, and we make opponents into enemies. And that dynamic is writ large with the former president and the mockery he's now making of the judicial system. During Reverend Sinkford's UUA presidency, and still now, Most of our congregations have been described as safe communities or as like-minded individuals. The acrimony then and now has seemed like it's something going on outside of our walls. But Reverend Sinkford knew then that we weren't immune. He could see the ways in which we could begin to divide. And he warned us to temper our rhetoric, which was full of phrases like radical hospitality and sacrificing ourselves for justice and fierce love. I gotta tell you, the phrase fierce love always worried me. Now, some thought of a lioness protecting her young, and that just seemed so natural and real and big and good. But when I would hear the phrase fierce love, I thought of the ways in which any of us can lose all sensibility when we think that the people we love are being threatened. And not just people, but anything we love is being threatened. And the thing is that when we feel threatened, when we feel like our loved ones are being threatened, fear kicks in. And nobody is at their best when they're afraid. When I thought of fierce love, I thought of jealous rage and dangerously overprotective parents. Now, fast forward through 20 years of siding with love, another phrase that came from his lips the first time, and all the increasing identity politics that we're living and working with in the UUA, you can really see how much we're struggling. I don't want to get into the details as I have in the past, but suffice to say that as an association, we seem to be divided into two camps. After not being able to ratify the eighth principle by a supermajority of congregation, one camp wants to drop the principles and adopt a new statement of values as part of Article 2 of our bylaws, replacing a lengthy statement with 7 words arranged a particular way. You can see the proposal on the front of your order of service, and you'll see that the words interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice are grouped around the word love. Love is at the center, which is really beautiful. Now, there's some text that goes along with this proposal, and that text explains a bit about each word in the context of Unitarian Universalism in our history and our current times, and it especially talks about how they relate to the unratified eighth principle. The thing I find really interesting, though, is while the 6 other words are defined, love is not. Which is ironic because the second camp I talked about, folks who often call themselves gadflies, they don't want to give up the principles. And they often say that they love the principles. And they will defend those principles fiercely. And many have said that to take away their principles is to attack them personally, to erase them as people, to render their presence in the UUA meaningless. It's very strident language. And it's a lot like the language that got really amped up on a national scale when we were arguing about Chads, the kind of language we thought we were immune to because we're so like-minded. Now, just to be clear, I am all for our living tradition, which seeks to never calcify into unchanging dogma, changing our statement of values. I'm really for this proposal that's shown on the front of our orders of service. And I'm also very mindful that the 8 principles, ratified or not, will always be with us. They won't just disappear as if they've never existed. And people who love them also won't disappear. And I want to be clear about another thing. Most congregations tend to fall pretty universally in one camp or the other based on the opinions of the majority. Few congregations are being torn apart by the Article 2 debates. Certainly this congregation is not being torn apart by any stretch. But online and at our annual General Assembly in June, things can get really ugly, like very, very ugly, because people fiercely love the principles or the process or the president of the UUA. And in their fear of loss, they will defend those people or those things at all costs. So it makes me nervous about having love at the center of our values, because we don't seem to agree what love is. Reverend Dr. King, whom we celebrate this weekend, talked a lot about love. Perhaps most famously, he said, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." Of course, he wasn't talking about romantic or even familial love, and he suggested that hate is the opposite of love. He was talking about agape, which he described as an overflowing love, which seeks nothing in return. Theologians, he said, would say that this is the heart of God's operating in the human heart. And when one rises to love on this level, he is able to love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. But honestly, I have two issues with the theologians that Reverend King paraphrased. Their words kind of smack of loving the sinner and hating the sin. And as someone whose very identity has been called sinful by many a Christian, that stings a little. And it doesn't sit comfortably with me in the way that it did with this mostly Christian audiences of the 1960s. More importantly, though, I wonder what agape means in a UU context, where most of us don't believe in an anthropomorphic Father God who is all-knowing, all-loving, and all-forgiving. But Reverend King's description of agape as an overflowing of love which seeks nothing in return, now that makes sense to me. An overflowing of love which seeks nothing in return. In a world where the eruptions of super strong emotions are causing constant turmoil and violence, an overflow feels gentler than an eruption. It feels kinder. It feels more approachable. An overflowing of love which seeks nothing in return, I think, is something that most UUs can get behind. And it feels achievable, while the word agape just feels so loaded and so unachievable. So what if, instead of thinking about love in the center, love in that center being intense and fierce, we think of that love as fondness? Like, seriously. I mean, love is intense and deeply personal. Our love defines us as people and directs all of our actions. Strongly held love is worth not only dying for, but killing for. But fondness, like, we're fond of things that bring quiet happiness to our lives. We're fond of people who neither threaten us nor demand too much of us. And when we're fond of someone, we appreciate them for who they are without letting them define us. We don't feel a need to turn them into something that they're not in order to feel better about ourselves. The people we are fond of walk alongside us. They accept us for who we are, even when we disagree. Now, I've known Elizabeth a while now, and I've worked closely enough with her to know something about what she believes and the values that she holds dear. And I've known enough Catholic religious, monks and nuns, to have some sense of the values that they're expected to behold on behalf of the church. And I would bet dollars to donuts that Elizabeth and Brother Michael probably disagreed about things that they both found to be important, even essential to the human experience. They may have disagreed about things like reproductive rights or trans rights or whether or not hell exists, that kind of thing. But they didn't let those differences get between them. And maybe there's a lesson in there for us UUs. Maybe we should hold our fondness for each other and our faith in higher regard than our fierce love for any of those trappings. More fondness that appreciates and unites, and less love that causes jealousy and division. Now, I'm not saying that we should change the center word to fondness. Ugh. Can you imagine that? We'd be singing things like standing on the side of fondness, or there is more fondness somewhere. It just doesn't ring as strong, right? But maybe it's time to be a little more nuanced about how we define love. And think of it more like the way we think of fondness. Just to take it down a notch so that it's more appreciating of people as they are, meeting them where they are, and agreeing to be in kind relationship. Maybe love needs to be defined not in terms of protecting and defending fiercely our loved ones and our identities, but more in terms of being open and available to everyone, including our opponents. Now, I'd like to invite you to stand and remain standing through the end of the service as we open our hymnals to number 131. Fondness will guide us. No, love will guide us. Love will guide us.